In this episode, James Cridland, the editor-in-chief of Podnews, is back to unpack some of the biggest shifts that happened in podcasting this year, as well as where we are headed next over the year ahead. We're also going to talk about why downloads might not be the gold standard in the industry much longer, as well as some of the other trends and shifts to pay attention to so you can stay ahead of the curve and learn how to adapt to the future of podcasting. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Earlier this year, you did an episode with your co-host, Sam Sethi, on some predictions this year that were going to be happening in the podcasting space. So I'm curious now, as we near the end of this year, looking back to say, okay, how many of those predictions have come true? And also, where do you think we're headed in the year ahead? What might we see coming up next? So at the start of this year, you predicted that YouTube would double the size of Google Podcasts. Has that come true? And speaking of video podcasting, what is it that you see for YouTube in podcasting in the future?
Well, so YouTube obviously closed Google Podcasts, so that's a great start. In terms of how YouTube is doing, very clearly YouTube is, depending on which research you look at, YouTube is the number one place where people consume podcasts. So people say. I'm not sure necessarily that research is entirely telling the full story. But certainly YouTube is, having a very large effect on the way that we think about podcasting. The announcements from Spotify as well, really showing that they see an awful lot of future in that video side. But certainly there are many more people now consuming podcasts and finding podcasts on these platforms. And from my point of view, actually, I would be perfectly happy if somebody found my podcast on YouTube once, never used YouTube again to listen to my podcast, but listened on their regular podcast app, whether it's Apple, whether it's Spotify, whatever it might be. Then YouTube would have done its job of helping new people find the show that I do. And as I say, you can be on YouTube without any video, and Sam and I don't do video because for at least one of us, it's very early in the morning or very late at night because he's in the UK and I'm normally in Australia. And so therefore, the time zones never line up. One of the things that I will also say is that it hasn't made, so far as I'm aware, any podcaster particularly rich. YouTube is not the way for you to earn cash out of what you do. So I think it's best to be thought of as a way for you to reach new audiences and for those audiences to then find you on whatever podcast platform they want to use.
And that's the beauty for me of podcasting, speaking very personally, is that I don't want to have to be on and put together and on video all of the time. And it's been a beautiful thing to be able to simply show up to the mic, stay consistent in creating content that serves my audience without the pressure of video. And I think that's where, this gets into a whole nother conversation, but about video, where it adds another layer of complexity. And if you're not someone who wants that complexity, or if you're not someone who is equipped at this moment in time, bandwidth-wise, to handle that kind of complexity, we feel this pressure because we don't want to miss out. Yet at the same time, is adding that actually going to help you if it's only going to spread you more thin, and if it's only going to dilute what you're doing? And I think it's such an important question that podcast hosts need to be asking themselves. Something else too, James, that I know you had predicted this earlier this year and that we have seen a lot is AI. How often and how frequently and how increasingly frequent it's being used in podcasting. Have we seen AI live up to the hype? And as AI generated content continues to grow, how do you think original content is going to compete?
I think AI is really good at making beige content that doesn't stand out. That is, it's fine. And I think AI is great at doing that. What humans are great at is making really exciting stuff that people want to listen to. Some humans are very good at making beige, boring things as well, to be fair. But I think what AI will never make something which is creatively exciting and, wow, you've got to have a listen, to this. So I think that is certainly part of it. But I think when you look at AI can be very useful in certain ways. I use AI every day when I'm writing the Podnews newsletter for one thing and one thing only, and that's when I finish writing the newsletter, I ask an AI tool from this newsletter, take the two most interesting stories and write a summary of those two stories in one short sentence. And that is the That is the description that you might see if you're listening to the daily podcast or if you get the daily newsletter. That is literally the only bit where I'm using AI, but it's that actually saves me. It just saves me a little bit of time, and it's something which is, using the content and the material that I have already made. So I've used AI for that. There's been one other time when I've used AI, and that is I was in an airport lounge because I have to record a daily podcast version of this thing as well. So I was in an airport lounge, and it was one of those quiet airport lounges where everybody was very studiously working and things. And normally I would just get the little microphone out that I carry with me when I'm doing traveling, and I will just happily record and sit and record. But I thought it's just too quiet in here. So I thought I'd better not. So I just uploaded a few bits of me talking, which I already had on my computer, to an AI tool called Wondercraft. And I said, just clone my voice. And I had my cloned voice reading that particular day's show. And, was very clear, this is a clone voice of me because it's too quiet in this airport lounge. But it was definitely me. It still sounded as if it was me, and it worked okay. Was it as good as the live version of James? Probably not. But did it actually help in terms of getting that individual show out? Yes, absolutely it did. So I think AI can be a useful tool, but I don't think AI is going to replace any humans quite yet.
Couple of things inherent in what you said is so important to notice. Number one, it was your input both
Yeah.
times. That's the key.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing for people to realize, is that if you want to position yourself as a thought leader in the industry, it actually has to be your thoughts. It can't be AI generated thoughts. And we know, like you said, it's pretty beige content that AI spits out. If you say, like, write me an article on, I don't know, weight loss or something, write me an article on podcasting, it's pretty generic. But as long as it's your input, definitely it can. Some of these tools can help save time. The other thing, James, that you said that I thought was really fascinating was that even though, some people are like, oh, don't ever clone your voice, and I don't know if that's a good idea. And you did a cost benefit analysis essentially there and said, okay, what's the lesser of two evils here? Missing the episode.
Yeah.
We know how important that consistency is for daily podcasts, or letting AI support me in this one unique instance where it was still my input, but at the same time, that content went out. You didn't sacrifice that.
Yeah.
And I think that's also important to realize, because when you fully take ownership of podcasting as your platform, we have to sometimes make those analyses and say, okay, well, what's the lesser of two evils here? I've got an episode that needs to go out. So speaking of episodes, something else you had predicted was that Apple Podcasts would launch on more platforms. And given the rise of Spotify, you're at that Spotify conference right now, YouTube, and how YouTube is trying to make a name for itself here in the podcasting space, what do you think Apple's doing? Has this materialized as far as this year, Apple launching on more platforms? What do you think their next move is going to be in the future as well?
I love the way that you're reminding me of all of these things, because I've completely forgotten them. And so I'm there going, oh, how do I explain this one away? Which is very funny. I was hoping that Apple would launch a Android app, because Apple is falling away. It used to be very much the number one podcast app. It isn't the number one podcast app in most countries now. Spotify is. Part of the reason for that is that Apple Podcasts, of course, is only available on Apple phones and isn't available on Android. Apple did actually make a few changes in August, and there is now a website version of the Apple Podcasts experience, which works great on a mobile phone. So if you don't have Apple Podcasts installed on your mobile phone, which probably means that you're using an Android phone, then you can just go to podcasts.apple.com, and it looks and works just like a mobile app does. So I guess I'm going to claim that as a yes. It's a weird one for Apple, because up until very recently, they've earned no money from podcasting. They've been a very benevolent dictator in terms of how podcasting works. But they've not necessarily, it's not been a business focus for them. I think it's a bit more of a business focus for them now, because there are premium subscriptions that you can pay for on the Apple platform. Apple takes their 30%. So there are benefits there. But it does worry me a little bit that Apple is very much falling behind in the race, and Spotify, and if you believe the hype, YouTube, doing consistently better than they are, in every piece of market research going. So yeah, it's a worrying thing, perhaps.
I think it's fascinating to think about, and it'll be interesting to see what does unfold there. Something else, too, this was the most fascinating prediction that you made, in my opinion, was the thought that IAB downloads are actually going to become less important over time. And I wonder, with the way that Apple is starting to shift, with the way that these other platforms are starting to
Mm.
rise up, on Spotify, it's a stream, on YouTube, it's a view, and we've got so much language now kind of competing for what used to just be very simple, which was downloads and, listens and plays as the industry began to evolve. Is there something that you think might take its place instead? Or do you think IAB downloads will remain somewhat of a gold standard here over the next few years? What do you think is going to happen there?
I think downloads are still very important. Downloads are the stat that pretty well every podcast has to follow because of open RSS, because your podcast is available on maybe 200 different podcast apps. So I think downloads will always have to exist. But for example, one of the recent announcements that Spotify made is that you are going to be paid not on the amount of downloads that your podcast gets, but you're going to be paid, certainly in terms of video, for how long someone is watching your show. So a simple, straightforward thing of if somebody watched your show for 100 minutes, then you're going to get 10 times more payments than if somebody only watched your show for 10 minutes. So those sorts of numbers are going to be more important as we move forward. You can see listen time on the Apple Podcasts platform. You can see listen time on the YouTube platform as well. And I think more and more we'll be looking at listen time over and above downloads, which could be automated, which might never be listened to. There's a lot of problems with that download figure. So I certainly see that there's going to be more focus on listen time, more focus on, audience participation, and even things like comments and things like that in the future. We have comments now per episode on Spotify. We have comments per episode on YouTube. Apple, of course, has its reviews as well. Those are all also useful interactive numbers that can show how successful a podcast is. So all of these numbers hugely important over and above just a download number. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about. And I'm curious, looking ahead over the next year, based on what we've just talked about and maybe anything that we didn't cover, what do you think are going to be, let's say, your top 3 predictions for podcasting over the next year? And specifically, what should new podcasters be paying attention to?
As I say, I think new podcasters, just get your show out there. Start podcasting, keep podcasting. Is the phrase, I believe. So actually, get your show out there is a very important thing. I think the thing that I would probably say to anybody who is starting a new podcast is focus on your workflow first. And what I mean by that is, how easy is it? How does it fit in with everything else that you are doing in your life to produce the podcast that you want to produce? And what does that mean for its format? What does that mean for how many guests you have, for example, if it's an interview podcast? What does it mean for how you make that show when it actually goes out? The workflow is really important, because what you don't want to happen is to start a podcast and within 2 months go, oh, this is much too much hard work, I can't do it, and then stop the podcast again, because that's not going to help anyone. So actually making sure that your workflow is as streamlined as you possibly can. That might mean asking for help for some other people. It might mean giving it a go for a couple of weeks to work out, okay, how much work is this really? And so one of the things that I thought when I was starting the Podnews newsletter, which comes out every day, one of the things that I thought about with that is, how can I make sure that if I need to, I can work for somebody else, I can do a full day's job, but still be able to get this newsletter out? What do I need to actually do with the newsletter in terms of timing, in terms of its format, in terms of how it gets to people, where I can shave as much time off doing the non-creative stuff so that I can focus on the creative? And so a lot of the initial thinking around how to do the Podnews newsletter was, well, let's make sure that it comes out at 6 in the morning New York time, because that happens to be 9 at night my time. And 9 at night my time is great because I could work for somebody else during the day if I wanted to. And the format of it is lots of very small paragraphs rather than great big long stories, because I'm not going to have the time to do great big long stories. So all of that stuff is really important. So taking that sort of workflow experience and working that into your new show is, I think, a very important part of that. And some of that might be using bits of AI to perhaps, I know that some people use AI to, I'm interviewing this person. What would be some good questions to ask them? At the very worst, you could ignore them because they'll be awful. But at best, there'll be 2 or 3 really good questions in there that you might want to ask. So I would certainly use some of those tools because they will give you ideas that perhaps you haven't actually had.
James, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I am so grateful to you for being here today to share all of your wisdom with us. You've given us so much to think about, so many great tips here. The work that you do with Podnews is just incredible. It's top of the top. Thank you for all you do to support podcasters, and thank you for being here today.
Been a great pleasure. Thank you.
And if you are not already subscribed to Podnews, the daily newsletter that James and his team produces, then go to the show notes and click the link to subscribe, because this is the #1 resource that all of us as podcasting experts use to stay informed and stay on top of the changes and trends that are happening in the industry. Because just like James said, when it comes to starting a new podcast or doubling down to grow an existing one, there is no better time than now to make a name for yourself in the industry. And that's why in the next episode, I have invited a fellow podcast host and clinical psychologist to join us to talk about the mental shifts that you need to make to get your head in the game and to stay in the game, as well as how to stay true to yourself in an industry where it is so tempting to compare yourself to others. That is all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.